Hello, everybody. So we're just letting folks in. We've got a huge number of people registered for today's webinar, which is fantastic. Importantly, really want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people of the Canberra region to pay respects to the elders past and present from these lands, and of course from the lands where people are joining us from across Australia and possibly beyond. So my huge pleasure to welcome you to the first Saving the World webinar for 2025. You may or may not know me, I'm Chakori. I head up the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse. This is an initiative of the ARC Laureate Fellowship. And as we always do in the webinar, in the Saving the World webinar series, this is all about trying to not just understand this big consumptogenic system that's contributing to climate change, to inequality, and to poor health, but really trying to pay attention to what are the ways to address and transform that consumptogenic system. How do we get to a system that is going to be good for the environment, for social and economic equity, and for health and well-being? And so what we do every month is we are joined by a speaker or two to look at different aspects of this consumptogenic system and the pathways forward. And so I'm really delighted today so myself and my colleague, Dr. Hridesh Gajurel. Hridesh is one of the Laureate research fellows. And we're in conversation with, chatting with Dr. Sabrina Chakori. So Hridesh is a political economist, has been researching for many years questions of varieties of capitalism, governance associated with that, particularly through the lens of corporate governance and well-being economies. And then Sabrina is really a kind of a leading in Australia and globally an expert around questions of degrowth. She's currently a fellow at CSIRO. I never remember what that acronym is for, but hopefully colleagues know what it is. Her research has focused on this interaction between social, economic, and ecological considerations, and so trying to really understand what that means and what that looks like for a socially just and an ecological, sustainably ecological transition here in Australia, globally. And Sabrina's been doing that, I say, in Australia, but also big sort of research collaborations around the world. She's got to go to some incredible countries, including Kenya, Ecuador, and Mexico, just to make us jealous. And importantly, she's the co-founder of the Degrowth Journal, and we're going to hear much more about degrowth from Sabrina. So two incredible minds to think about these big questions of the consumptogenic system. What does that mean for the environment? What does that mean for social justice? What does that mean for health and well-being? And so we thought in a number of the webinars, but particularly today, to really think about these questions of the economy and economics, because of course, at the core of the consumptogenic system is the economic system, and particularly the dominant economic system in sort of Western countries of this kind of unfettered economic growth, which is just absolutely driving this excessive production and consumption of fossil fuel goods and services that are just not good for the environment, and they're so unequally valued and distributed, and they're not very good for human health either. And so this notion of growth, that governments, that firms, that industries have to work towards, this idea of having to work towards growth, regardless of these environmental, social, and health consequences. But of course, countries, and particularly industrialized countries around the world, are really struggling with this question of growth in their economies. We saw that during COVID-19, you know, countries, including here in Australia, big shock to the system. We've seen that with Russia's invasion into the Ukraine, big shock to the system, the economic system, and a whole load of stagnation that's taken place around the world. And what does that mean for societies? So it's a really difficult situation for governments globally and here in Australia. How do they think about, should they think about that stimulation of growth and how that clashes with environmental, social, and health considerations? So these are the big challenges, I think, one of the major challenges, I think, for us right now. And so we're going to talk about that with Hridesh and Sabrina. So Hridesh, I'm going to come to you first. And Nick had very kindly forwarded on a few questions that he had prepared when he didn't realise that he was about to be sitting in the hospital. But so let me just come to you, Hridesh. You've done a lot of work looking at this question of varieties of capitalism. You know, we often say capitalism, the root of all our problems, but what you've shown and what the literature shows is there's a whole varieties of capitalism that exist. So do you want to maybe just tell us a little bit more about that in the context of sort of contemporary world, how these different economic models have taken place and what that means, really?
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. Yeah, so basically, the idea is that there is not just, like you said, not just one type of capitalism, but different types of capitalism in the world, right? And that also means then that one type of capitalism versus another, it has different implications for things like well-being, things like environmental sustainability, and so forth. The way that the varieties of capitalism literature, you could say, has approached this question is by looking, you could say, probably exclusively at the market or the economic system, kind of setting aside the state's role a little bit in that, which we'll get back to later. But um, so capitalist economies, political economies, have generally been divided into two types. So one is a liberal market economy. So that includes the US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, most of the Anglosphere, basically. And then you also have what is called a coordinated market economy. And that includes Germany, Japan, a lot of the Northern European countries, and so forth. So they are considered somewhat different from liberal market economies in that the way that they coordinate their economy is less market oriented and built on relations and built on certain institutions that go beyond just free market association. Um, now, the differences between the two, sometimes, they're also associated with a shareholder-dominated system and a stakeholder-oriented system. So the liberal market economy system, like the US, is often called a shareholder-oriented or shareholder primacy system as well, from an economic perspective. Whereas countries like Germany and Japan, they're considered a bit more stakeholder oriented. Right? They're still capitalist, so they still generally want growth or go after growth and go after profits. And Sabrina is going to talk about kind of going beyond that as well, which is probably what is required now. But what I'm going to talk about is how perhaps certain types of capitalist systems are more progressive when it comes to well-being, and to an extent environmental sustainability as well. So we probably know quite a bit about, because we are in Australia, about Australia and the way it has gone about its economic system, and environmental sustainability. We probably know a bit about the US as well, especially now, with Trump, how it's going and how it has been going. But maybe many people might not know maybe enough about Germany, for example, and how the economic system there operates in comparison to the US and Australia. So one of the distinguishing features of the German economic system is basically its formal laws, that are much stronger in the interest of workers, so that they favor workers a lot more, especially when it comes to decision making at firms. So large firms in Germany, they so firms with more than 2,000 employees are required to have at least 50% representation on their highest corporate board, which is called the supervisory board. So at least half the representatives on the board are employees. So obviously they're going to look after the interests of employees. Not only that, they have a different law as well, which is called is related to what is called the work councils, and these are kind of shop floor or factory floor laws where workers of a company get to look after their own interests. So they have veto power over company decisions when it comes to things like layoffs, when it comes to things like worker conditions, working conditions, and a lot of those other things, work hours as well. So in that sense, the laws in Germany are much more favorable, arguably, to workers, compared to places like Australia and definitely the US. And not only in terms of workers. So in varieties of capitalism, it divides the economic system into 5 different spheres. So one is employment relations, kind of what we talked about already, and finance and corporate governance. So, finance and corporate governance being whether it's a shareholder-oriented system or a stakeholder-oriented system, with the liberal market economies being much more market-based. So, guided by market behaviors and market actors, like stock market investors, institutional investors, whereas in places like Germany and Japan, there's much more bigger role for long-term investors, like sometimes banks, but also families, and sometimes even the state as well. So the other sphere is worker training, and generally when it comes to workers, the liberal market system is much more liberal, and so it leaves it up to them to kind of train themselves and so forth. But in places like Germany, workers are helped by the state and companies themselves for training. So there's a high rate of employment for vocational training straight off of vocational school. In fact, they get placed in corporations, in companies to do their training and so forth. So it's a much smoother transition, and again, better for workers in that sense as well. Then there's, of course, industrial relations, and unions are very powerful in Germany. In Japan, for example, they have a different kind of union. It's more enterprise-based unions. But Germany has sector-based unions that are powerful. Another coordinated market economy, Sweden, also has a very strong union movement, with a majority of workers, even in this day, being part of unions. And they set wages and conditions often at a national level in Sweden, at a sectoral level in Germany. So all these things then go on to benefit workers, right? So in that sense, at least in terms of working conditions and employment security, these systems can be said to be better for workers. Now, all these different spheres, the way they are set up institutionally, also makes coordinated market economies and the firms within them more long-term oriented. So liberal firms in liberal market economies, especially the big firms, are known for being short-termist. So just thinking about the quarterly earnings or shareholder payouts in the short term, and so forth. Whereas in coordinated market economies, they're much more longer term thinking. So that also makes them, coordinated market economies, more environmentally friendly and more thoughtful about sustainability, because in the long term, sustainability and investing in sustainability benefits the companies themselves. And so for that reason, the companies themselves, being long-term oriented, tend to invest more in sustainability, and that is kind of shown up in indicators as well. Now, even because workers also are on the board, in Germany, for example, they also often push for sustainability and environmental outcomes, because they are concerned, about the long-term future of the firm and, of course, the community as well. So all these things at the economy level tend to make coordinated market economies like Germany and Japan and Sweden definitely more worker friendly. So in terms of, and obviously because workers make up the majority of a country, it would be better for the welfare or well-being of the worker in that sense. However, what I also want to point out, though, that there is no guarantee that being a liberal market economy is tied to worse performance in environmental outcomes or policies. And similarly, just being a coordinated market economy doesn't mean that a country is advanced in its climate goals and environmental sustainability. Now, a great example here is the UK. So the UK is a liberal market economy, but it is much more progressive, let's say, compared to Japan, when it comes to its environmental goals and achievements as well. Now, the difference here is that even though from an economic perspective, the UK is a liberal market economy, it's the state action has made this possible. The state level policies, which the varieties of capitalism framework kind of ignores a little bit, the state level policies have, which includes, strong carbon laws, renewable energy targets, phasing out of coal, and all of that, which has been done in the UK for a long time. And there is also consensus across the party line. So Conservative Party is progressive in terms of climate goals as well, especially compared to the Republicans in the US. And so all of these at the state level then make the UK much more progressive when it comes to environmental policies. On the other hand, Japan, which is a coordinated market economy and arguably good for at least employment protection and certain aspects like inequality when it comes to worker employment and wages, does not do so well when it comes to environmental sustainability. And that is because the state has been much slower in its environmental policies, much slower in adopting progressive environmental policies, and forcing Japanese companies to be environmentally friendly. It's part of the norm in Japan to not be very hands-on, and so not kind of require companies to do things. But the downside of that has been that companies have been more free to pollute and be less progressive in terms of climate action. So the important thing is, so while being a coordinated market economy is good for workers generally, and to an extent, better for stakeholders more widely compared to liberal market economies, there's no guarantee that that will lead on to environmental goals as well. It's more likely to because of the long-term orientation, but there's no guarantee. So yeah, that's kind of the varieties of capitalism framework summed up, with a little bit of criticism of that framework as well. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Hridesh. And we're obviously going to come back to you. I'll come to Sabrina now, but we'll come back to you because I know you've been thinking about how to think about sort of ideational change that can help create the sorts of institutional change that you've been alluding to. So Sabrina, Hridesh has been speaking about obviously kind of economic models, either the liberal market economy or the coordinated market economy, and it's they are still working within that growth paradigm, I think it'd be fair to say, but with the sorts of sorts of breaks that government intervention can do if they choose to do that. Could you tell us a bit more about, or your thoughts on all of your work, really thinking about actually breaking that dependency on this growth idea?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, thanks everyone for being here during your lunch break if you're based in Australia. Or at the time, I'm tuning in from Gadigal country. And before even jumping into new economic system, I just want to recognize that First Nation communities in this country have had sustainable economies and societies for centuries. And that's an important knowledge that we also need to recognize. Thanks, Hridesh. I like this interdisciplinary conversation. Thanks for providing very insightful information. But I just thought that because we're here and I don't really know who's in the room, to do a step backward before jumping into, how can we shift away from economic growth, just to put us all on the same level of understanding, because it can get really tricky. And I feel that if we are serious about changing the economic system, then we need to understand the current one more in depth. And one thing that I often like to begin with is the question, which I pose to you, but also to myself, on how could we create an unsustainable society? And we could think about, we could do that by increasing resource consumption per capita, by polluting oceans, rivers, by creating and keeping unemployment, and at the same time increasing the working poor class, so people that have multiple jobs and still struggle to thrive in modern economies. We also could create malnutrition. We still see that there are like undernourished people and overnourished or malnourished people in societies. So if that was our to-do list, we are very on track with that. And that's unfortunately not there. There are crises. We are living in a poly and permanent crisis, but this crisis, I like to think about it as the system is functioning as it's designed to. So these are not unexpected crises. And the social and ecological harm that we are facing now, they are mainly related to the economic growth system that we just mentioned. But what is economic growth and how it works? So I'm not a political economist, so I won't go into the depth of different capitalist systems, but capitalism and capitalist economies rely on economic growth. And we still have this perception that an increase in growth equates prosperity. And put in maybe simpler terms, we often hear about GDP, the gross domestic product, and countries keep having this socioeconomic narrative that we need to increase this indicator. We need to achieve a higher GDP every year. But what is that GDP? What does it capture? What that economic growth really represents is basically GDP accounts for all the market transactions, so all the products and services produced and exchanged in an economy. GDP does not account for any non-market transactions, so all the volunteer work, care work for elders, for kids are not counted into GDP. And most importantly, GDP doesn't even differentiate between let's say, activity that lead indeed to prosperity and negative one. So if an industry produces something and pollutes a river, that increases GDP, and the cleanup that it's involved in cleaning that river, it's also increasing GDP. And I also like to almost provoke often the reaction of thinking, oh, if your country is not increasing GDP enough, you can have a car accident. That increases GDP. Today, if you get a car accident and all the repairing, and if you even end up in hospital, that increases GDP. Divorces, so the more difficult a divorce is, the more lawyer fees, etc. So when we start thinking that all of these activities that often are perceived as negative actually contribute to GDP, it makes us question how prosperity is defined and accounted for. I just want also to highlight that GDP itself is not problematic. It's just an indicator. It measures markets transaction. The problem is that GDP became a policy objective and it's not just an indicator. And in order to stimulate that economic growth goals that our modern economies are have in place at the moment, we came up with all kind of market mechanisms, such as, for example, planned obsolescence. Since the 70s and 80s, industrial designers started to being taught how to design products so that the durability of the product would be reduced, so that consumers would have to replace more often electronic products, printers, computers, phones, etc. And by replacing the products, obviously, companies make more profit, and that contributes at the macro level to GDP growth. So planned obsolescence, which uses resources, creates e-waste, and so on, with also many social negative effects. It's a market mechanism to increase economic growth. Another example that I often like to highlight is intra-industry trade. So we have globalization of various products. For example, I worked on food system a lot in my PhD and postdoc, and we have this intra-industry trade, which means that we import and export the same products. So for example, the US imports beef from South America and exports beef to Europe. So this is different from a need-based globalization, where we import and export based on needs the population have. These all we have also products like apples that often they're produced somewhere and then sent elsewhere to get waxed and so on and packaged in another country. So all of these mechanisms promised a better economic welfare, and in some aspect we did improve many aspects in society, but the problem is that they come with a social and ecological cost that we can't neglect anymore. So all of these, one could argue, yes, but economic growth led to well-being, and that is yes and no. There are actually studies that look at the paradox of well-being. Tim Jackson wrote already in 2009 a book called Prosperity Without Growth, but there have been many publications since that show that, especially in industrial countries, and we can discuss this later, but there's a weak correlation between increase in income and reported life satisfaction. We're also seeing that there are other indicators that need more attention, like in industrialized countries, we are seeing an increase in working poor, a decrease in trust in institutions, and so on. So well-being is not always correlated with economic growth. Another argument that could be put forward is, but capitalist economies led to, shift away from poverty. But data show that poverty is on the rise, as malnutrition is. And I just read this reference, Human Rights Council report published in May 2024 that states at the beginning, an increase in GDP is not a precondition for the realization of human rights or combating poverty and inequalities. As long as the economy is driven mainly by profit maximization, it will respond to the demand expressed by the richest group of society, leading to extractive form of production that worsen social exclusion, and then it goes on. So basically, it is recognized that the current system is not leading to well-being, nor is alleviating poverty. And with all of this framework now, the big question is, how do we shift away from this complex system? And I explore economic degrowth or post-growth as an alternative economic model. And in a nutshell, but then we can discuss further. I'm not making justice to all the literature here. Economic growth basically calls for an economy that respects planetary boundaries, and it calls for a reduction in the economic metabolism, meaning reducing the unnecessary production and consumption of goods and services that we could cut off from society. And basically, economic degrowth is asking to place at the center of well-being, social and ecological well-being, rather than profit and growth. With that, then economic growth, and I'm sure we can discuss later, comes with different, more tangible changes put forward. And the last bit, and then I might pass it back to you, Sharon, is in parallel to the economic growth development in the literature and social movements, the main dominant narrative of change is green growth. And that is very different. And we might hear green growth, green growth promoters are often people that hold a more technocratic view, hoping that technology or technological advances would improve social and ecological well-being. But there are several limitations at that. And first of all, the relative decoupling that green growth is promising. And relative decoupling means that basically the hope is that with an improved technological advance, we can decouple resource use and greenhouse gases emission, except there are no data showing that this decoupling is happening. And the other issue with that is that better technology don't translate automatically in better social outcomes. Because if even if we have more efficient technologies, if the societal goal is to increase growth, then we will do anything in our power to continue expand the economic production and consumption, which means any offset in environmental gains that come with this technology may be just offset by the fact that we will produce more. And just to conclude, some scholars might say that economic growth became uneconomic. And again, there was a Nature paper published at the end of last year that showed that we're already on track for climate damages worth 38 trillion per year by 2050. And, obviously we're calling for solutions that look more at mitigating costs rather than just offsetting them with technological solutions.
Great, thanks, Sabrina. Lots to unpack in there, isn't there? It always strikes me, so just with Desh's remarks as well, there's this real tension of globally, I think, of do we try to make no, let me stop. Let's not use the word we. Trying to make an economic system better, towards the environment, etc., by changing just what's happening within it, or actually changing the economic system completely. And I think it's an ongoing tension. Of course, it's not straightforward at all. But a key point, I think, also that you were making there was this sort of breaking away of the notion that growth equals prosperity. And in fact, of course, it does not. If we think about prosperity in that much more holistic way, as you were pointing towards. So Desh, I just want to bring you back in briefly, and then I'm going to come to Sabrina again, and then we're going to open up for discussion with the audience. So if we can just kind of keep this little bit a wee bit slightly briefer. But, Desh, so both your earlier remarks and what Sabrina has just said really challenges sort of ideas, paradigms, institutional arrangements, all sorts of things that are your kind of bread and butter. What does that look like? And if you think of, like here in Australia, our political environment is just so timid, for want of a better word. What are some of the opportunities? I'm going to keep it as opportunities. What are some of the opportunities for these big ideational and institutional changes that are really so necessary if we're going to advance planetary health equity? And can you give us a sense of hope?
I'll try to. So, basically the reality is, giving us the opportunity, to be honest, because as you know, the economic system that we have currently is built on a theory, which is the orthodox economic theory or neoclassical economics. And governments have also then kind of subscribed to neoclassical economics as their go-to economic theory, the way to run the country. And thus they have resisted kind of this need almost to move away from the kind of system that is described by neoclassical economics as the best system, right? So when I said, reality has given us the opportunity, is because now repeatedly, time and time again, a lot of the tenets of economic theory, assumptions of neoclassical economic theory is being proven wrong, or at least, is incomplete. Starting, let's say, with even before that, of course, but, GFC, the global financial crisis, dealt a huge blow to economic theory, although nothing radical came out of that in terms of ideational shift. I think there was a recognition, which was summed up by Alan Greenspan, who was the governor of the central bank in America at the time and associated with neoliberalism. He said we were wrong when we thought our assumptions that the market is going to be self-regulatory. We were wrong. So, such a prominent figure within neoclassical economics, especially monetarist policy, saying such a thing kind of acknowledges the situation we're in, and even not just the GFC. So that's a big dent in economic theory. But after that as well, there are a lot of incidents that have kind of shown assumptions of economic theory to be wrong. A lot of decoupling, for example. So I was just looking at Jim Chalmers the other day and the speech he was making about interest rate cuts and how happy he was and so forth, and celebrating the soft landing that Australia had achieved when it comes to controlling inflation. And he sounded like as if, that the soft landing was such a rare thing to do, when it comes to economic theory. But the fact is that a lot of the countries, advanced economies around the world, achieved soft landing. US has probably achieved soft landing. UK has achieved soft landing. So basically, what was thought of as being rare or impossible, perhaps even according to economic theory, came out to be true. And so, what is also being shown by reality is that a lot of these advanced economies are now stagnating. So this idea that growth can be unlimited, that it can go on forever, is again also being challenged by economic reality, which is that most advanced economies have stagnated in terms of economic growth, no matter what they try to do, or even when they regulate highly for growth or deregulate highly for growth. Regardless of what they do, all these advanced economies tend to be stagnating. And so the reality is that, it's a world, especially for high-income countries, it's a world without growth anyway. So the idea is whether you want to still stick to the old economic orthodoxy when it's been proven wrong so many times, and then keep going with it in a way that is just irrational, basically. Or do you accept the reality of climate change and all other crises in health crises, inequality, and so forth, all these challenges, and say, okay, well, maybe it's time we move on from in neoclassical orthodox economic theory to something else that would enable us to tackle climate change, inequality, and poor health around the world.
Yeah. And yeah, so I suppose what you're highlighting there, Hridesh, is the economic theory is totally, the dominant economic theory is totally not fit for purpose, and then it becomes a political choice of whether you actually want to do something good. And so, Sabrina, you've been looking, I suppose, sort of related to that, of this question of ex-novation, which, like actually stopping doing these harmful things. And I'm just going to, just before you do start to speak, there was a sort of a question in the chat, sort of saying this just is like, it's so hard, this is such a big complex topic. But I think, what Hridesh has just said and what you speak about when you speak about ex-novation, like some of this is actually just really doable, but it's a choice. And for communities, as Rhiannon was sort of saying, what can communities do? I think if communities believe that change is possible, and then pushing up to our politicians to do some of this ex-novation type work, wouldn't that be fantastic? So do you want to, again, fill us with hope, Sabrina, about what can happen if ex-novation was to actually take place?
Sure. Well, just to connect to this intervention, you know, we have these economic theories, and I should highlight that these are just theories, because this idea that neoliberal capitalism is working and the private sector is leading all these big achievements, it's just a theory. One could argue that neoliberal capitalism is a state-supported capitalism, and we know that lots of big agribusiness corporations and so on get subsidies, and they are supported. You know, during the financial crisis, government intervened to save some institutions. So one could even argue if a proper neoliberal capitalist system is still in place. But beyond that, I think I'm not sure, hopefully I will get there towards the end of today, but I think that there are some very clear steps that we could undertake to at least untangle the complexity of the system. And the first one, and this is why I do a lot of engagement to democratize the economic understanding, is I think the first step should be to understand the economic system. It became so complex and so alienating for many people that we don't even know anymore how society and the socioeconomic system works. And why understanding it is important is that lead us to step 2, which is pointing out the responsibility. You know, we often tend, we need to do this and this, but we know that we live in a world where, and again, here I quote the UNEP latest report, the richest 10% of the world population are consuming 20 times more than the poorest 50%. So here in this system, there are clear agents, drivers of the crisis, and we should allocate that responsibility to those agents. So once we have that in clear, again, the literature doesn't lack of proposition of reforming and shifting towards a different economic system. From a macro level perspective, we could push for a beyond GDP system and rethink the systems of national accounts, centering socio-ecological well-being indicators and related policies. If you look at, you know, more at the meso industrial level kind of thing, even like changes as simple as banning planned obsolescence. And we have small pockets of, you know, of intervention in that sense. For example, Apple was found having planned obsolescence in their software in France, and they got a fine. It was a very small fine for Apple a few years ago, but that indicates that, you know, planned obsolescence mechanism should be banned. The UN Secretary General and many others are also talking about banning advertisement, and that's also the problem. Sometimes we associate degrowth with a reduction in consumerism, which is partially true, but I prefer to talk about reduction in productivism. There are so many mechanisms in society that lead us to consume, so it's unfair to put always the blame and responsibility on consumers. And advertisement, marketing, and so many other mechanisms are just one example. We should be tackling time poverty, which lead to unhealthy diet and many other issues. Again, the literature on degrowth points out a work sharing mechanism. You know, once we had this idea of, you know, as a society of achieving a prosperity where people would work less. And sometimes I wonder where that dream of working less ended up, right? Now we're just trying to have these incremental changes to, you know, tweak around. But what if we would all work, you know, 3, 2, 4, let's open up the discussion days a week? And what if the prosperity of a nation would be based on how much free time people have rather than how much productive we are. And if that would become, you know, the goal, the national goals, then all policies would follow. Again, there's a scholar, Australian scholar based in Portugal, Nick Fitzpatrick, and he wrote this paper called Exploring Degrowth Policy Proposal. You know, he talks about caps on resource use and emission, ecological tax reform. So the literature is really extensive on changes. So now the problem is, I don't even think the problem relates on community getting organized. So that's probably my 4th point. We do need to get organized, but communities are already trying to get organized. They're always there to respond to crises. The problem, and that we should face, is that we know that there's political capture. And IPCC reports, I think the chapter 17 published in 2022 talks clearly about groups that undermine transitions, but fossil fuels that, you know, undermine political systems that are trying to achieve the transitions. And then, yeah, my work at the moment at CSIRO looks at exnovation. So again, in the green growth, technocratic vision of society, there's this idea that we need always more innovation, technological or social. And innovation, simply put forward, is like adding new things to the system, new product, new business model, new startup, and so on. Exnovation, and is a very infant literature in exnovation, but looks at how we can phase out, so actively plan the termination of unsustainable elements. So for example, we know that malnutrition leads to obesity in society, again, to just refer to food systems. Instead of adding a new app on your phone that tells you how to track your diet, or adding a new product or a new label, could we just ban junk food marketing, or could we just ban junk food altogether? So which kind of policies do we have that can undo the unsustainable elements? And obviously, when we talk in particular about exnovation or phasing out of fossil fuels or other elements, we have to consider justice elements, because otherwise we saw, for example, the European Union, they try to exnovate some elements in agricultural policies and so on, and then farmers backlashed on that. So when transition are not thought or, you know, planned with justice elements, then we risk to have obviously resistance from top-down actors, but we also risk backlashes and resistance from the bottom up. But in terms of, you know, so I think my first point is understand the system, who's responsible. We do already have potential path forward, getting organized. And finally, I think the last point is we really need, especially in this time, you know, as we talk here, you know, today, probably we're going to switch on the news later and, you know, get back to the reality of the geopolitical instability. But I think that now more than ever, especially in academia, but elsewhere in community, we need to keep alive the idea that a non-capitalist society can exist. And in fact, it does exist. There are niches, you know, in South America, we have the Via Campesina, we have First Nation people, we have communities. I run a Degro enterprise, the Brisbane 2 Library. So these things exist. They're just shadow network that needs visibility. And I think, yeah, politically, we need stronger social movement to overcome probably the political capture that we're experiencing.
Brilliant, thanks, Sabrina. So lots of suggestions of like ways forward, you know, the things that we need within society. Of course, incredible power differentials within society that really stop some of that happening.